Okay, I think we're going to get started. I'm still admitting people, but I think we should get started because this is going to be a long presentation. Um, Hi, thanks for joining us. My name is Talia White, and I'm the treasurer of the Friends of the Roslindale Library. We're a community advocacy group for the branch. We host programming year round and raise money for the library. We're very excited about the library reopening. We still don't have an official opening date yet, but it is scheduled to reopen in late October, early November. To learn more about the library reopening, as well as our other programs, making donations, or joining our email list, you can go to friendsoftheroslindalelibrary.org. Uh, and we're very excited tonight to be joined by Roslindale resident Alan Wright, who just fulfilled his lifelong dream of cycling cross country. He started his solo trip on May 22nd in Boston and completed the journey on August 5th in Seaside, Oregon. He used this trip to bring awareness to climate change and raise funds for Bikes Not Bombs. Alan rode more than 4,200 miles over 73 days. That was only half the trip. After riding across the country, Alan saw America from another vantage point. Alan rode Amtrak from Oregon home to Boston. We're all looking forward to learning more about his fantastic trip. I know I'm definitely looking forward to the talk because I'm both a cycling and an Amtrak enthusiast. But before I hand it off to Alan, I just had a little housekeeping to do. Because we have a very large crowd tonight, we're only going to take questions, audience questions through the chat to help keep the discussion moving and try to answer everyone's questions tonight. You can leave your questions in the chat during Alan's presentation, and I will come back on after the talk and ask your questions to Alan on your behalf. We'll also need everyone to stay on mute for the entirety of the program so we can hear everything Alan has to say about his trip. And finally, tonight's program will also be recorded and posted on the Friends website later this week. And now I hand it off to Alan.
Thank you very much for arranging this, and thanks so much for your advocacy and work on behalf of the Roslindale Public Library. I also want to thank Laura Gang for scheduling this with Talia and the Friends and giving me a motivation to go through all my pictures and videos. And yeah, the last couple of days have been pretty interesting. I felt like I've been back on the trip. So I'm calling this Seeing America Slowly, at least as slowly as I bicycled. This opening screenshot is from the Illinois-Michigan Canal that is just about 3 miles from my hometown. My friends and I, when I was a child growing up in LaSalle, Illinois, used to bicycle down on this path all the time. And I always dreamt about keeping going instead of stopping wherever we stopped. I just wanted to keep riding my bicycle. They have since, the state of Illinois has since fixed up this towpath a lot, and you can now ride all the way almost to Chicago or the other direction all the way to Des Moines, Iowa. So I did major portions. You'll see some more pictures of it. So my bicycle ride from Boston to Seaside, Oregon. This is the route. It's kind of zigzag. I went up through New York State and south of Lake Erie, and then out in Illinois, I dropped down to St. Louis. Then I went across Missouri to just west of Kansas City. And then I went up north through Nebraska and up through the Black Hills. And I did that in part because I wanted to cross the Rockies in Montana and Idaho, where the altitude is not quite as high. And then I went across to Oregon. The Berkshires were just about the worst part of my ride. Maybe that's partly because it was the first couple of days of riding and I had way too much gear with me, but also because the hills in the Berkshire are very steep. The only time during my entire trip that I had to walk my bicycle was a hill in the Berkshires that was a 17% grade. I had to walk about a quarter of a mile. It was brutal. The Bighorn Mountains in central Wyoming were where I had the highest pass that I went over at 9,600 feet, but it wasn't a very difficult climb. It was no more than 10%. And then out in Montana and Idaho, it was pretty gradual climb, so it was very doable. The stats, a little summary here. So I bicycled 4,440 miles from Boston to Seaside, Oregon. I rode that entire distance except for 2 auto trips at 4,300 miles. So the total distance I traveled was about 4,700. I had 59 days of pedaling coast to coast, spread over 72 days. There were rest days that I took in between visiting family and friends. I averaged about 72 miles a day, which was a little more than 10 miles per hour. And I was on the road for about 10 hours a day. I'd sometimes break camp and be riding by 7. Sometimes it was 8. So I'd go on till 4 or 5 in the afternoon, depending upon the heat. I climbed and descended a total of about 175,000 feet. So that's going up and coming down many different times. I crossed 16 states from Massachusetts through Oregon. Nearly 2,000 miles of my trip were on railroad bicycle trails or canal towpaths. And I'm going to talk about that in more detail and show you some videos later on. I rode on dirt roads, gravel, asphalt, county, state, and 3 times I rode on the interstate in Montana and Oregon. I camped, stayed in motels with family and friends, and I used the warm shower service. I had no flats or breakdowns, but I did change my bicycle chain 3 times. And I ate a lot of food all day long, but I always woke up famished. Come on, let's go there. All right. There. So why ride? Sorry, I'm having a little mouse trouble here. Get this thing right. So why do this ride? I've always wanted to adventure cycle since I was a child and a teenager when with a church group, I took a ride across southern Wisconsin. I wanted to see America, visit family and friends, places of my youth, and ride the back roads, especially the back roads. And I wanted to promote bicycling as a solution to climate change. One of the things that was interesting about this ride, you can see this sign on this little gas station door. This was, I don't know, someplace in Pennsylvania or Ohio. It says, no politics. Nobody on my trip wanted to talk about anything that was controversial at all. So I left Boston Harbor. I dipped my wheels supposedly in the harbor. But the only thing I forgot was that it was low tide, so I had to pour water on my wheels. But August 5th, when I got to Seaside, Oregon, I was actually able to wheel the bike out into the soft sand of the Pacific. I left a naive cyclist, and I'm not sure I came back any wiser. I'll let you determine that for me. Day 1 of my ride was unbelievable. Come on, yep. Before I'd even finished my breakfast, there were tons of friends out in the driveway and a whole group of people that rode with me for the first 10 or 15 miles of my ride. On day 1, when I did about 70 miles, I rode on 3 bicycle trails, one of them just outside Needham for about a mile, and the other 2 in south of Worcester and then in Connecticut that were for a total of about nearly 30 miles. And here's a little video of that first rail trail. Oh, come on. The Douglas State Forest Rail Trail. I suppose this bridge is probably 150, maybe 200 years old. See if there's a marker. Amazing stone. So the day continued like that. My route, where was I going, why, and how? My destination was Oregon to visit family. And on the way, I wanted to visit family and friends in Great Barrington, Kalamazoo, my hometown of LaSalle, Illinois, St. Louis, and farming family in central Kansas. I used the adventure cycling maps to plat out the core routes, the Northern Tier route, Route 66, Transamerica, and the Lewis and Clark trails. But I also added in as many bicycle and canal paths as possible using the Rails to Trails Trail Link app. And you can see that in the lower screen here. Each of those big blue dots represents a state, but spread all over the United States, especially in the Northeast and Midwest, there are just thousands and thousands of rail trails. It's really a remarkable thing. And you can, from the app, you can download the maps of each of the trails. So for example, I rode the Katy Trail in Missouri from just above St. Louis at St. Charles, followed the Missouri River, and then it veered southwest to below Kansas City. That was 240 miles. I rode about 220 of those miles, and I'll show you some shots from that. I rode the Erie Canal Trail, which is mostly the towpath, but also some rail trails from Schenectady all the way to Buffalo. That was a fabulous ride. And then in South Dakota, I rode the Mickelson Trail through the heart of the Black Hills. It's an old railroad line that was built back in the 1880s after they discovered gold. And I rode it with some friends all the way up to Spearfish, Montana. You'll see some slides of that as well. When I didn't have an adventure cycling map, a route to follow, or a trail, I customized my other routes using various GPS apps. So this is my first day's ride. And I had produced this using a German mapping software called Komoot, which works really nicely. You put in your starting point, your destination point, and it maps out the route that has the least traffic roads, and it builds in as many rail trails as possible. So here's a rail trail right here, and then over here running down. And this route took me all the way to Woodstock, Connecticut, about a 75-mile ride. This was a ride through Kansas after my rail trail ended there. I also used Ride with GPS and would drill down occasionally with Google Maps. So my son asked me to put together a little video to put up on Twitter about what it's like to ride. So I've been asked to tweet about what it's like to ride. So here I am on the Erie bike path. It's 88 degrees, moderate humidity. I'm drinking buckets of water. I'm doing about a 14-mile average pace. This is an old railroad line that's probably got about a 2% uphill grade. Remember, the railroad was going from Buffalo down to Albany, mostly downhill. I've got a lot of riding positions. I can ride in the drops, as I am right now, or I can sit up, or I can duck in as though I was a triathlon rider. And you can see that the handle grips are wide so that my palms get a lot of cushion. So I'm having fun, working, not too hard. And unless it gets too hot out in the West, I think I've got this in the bag. Bye. So there wasn't much humility going on there. I did make it, but there were some hiccups along the way. I just want to check. Could everyone hear that video well enough? Good. Okay. I very quickly became obsessed with food. I'd go to bed hungry after eating a big meal, and I'd wake up starving, sometimes in the middle of the night. This is called riding and eating. It's the only way to make time and keep enough calories in. Yesterday's leftover breakfast burrito. on my morning roll from Morris, Illinois to LaSalle, my hometown. Cheers. I had first and second breakfasts. For those of you who are Lord of the Rings fans, you'll remember that I think it was Pippin or maybe it was Merryweather who complained about not getting a second breakfast. I quickly learned that the night before I went to sleep, I had to have my breakfast prepared in a bag that I could just start eating right away as I packed up my tent and got ready to ride. But by 10 o'clock in the morning, I was hunting for a breakfast joint where I could down an omelet and, potatoes and toast and so on. I figure I was consuming between 6,000 to 8,000 calories a day. Normal metabolism for someone my size requires about 2,000 calories. So I was eating 3 to 4 times what I would normally. I just ate all the time. But when I ate, I couldn't eat too much at one sitting during the day. It was a favorite thing to do was to pack some peanut butter and jelly English muffins with fruit in my little travel bag and eat as I rode. Nevertheless, even though I had pig out dinners, I lost 12 pounds. I'm still gaining weight back. I'm still hungry all the time. It's kind of crazy. It's very hard to eat well on the road. There's fried this, junk that, too much meat. I mean, the further west you get, it's just meat, 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 meat. So my salvation was Mexican food. Every little town in the United States seems to have one or more Mexican restaurants. And when you get into one of these little towns and everything else is closed, the Mexican joint's open. And guess what? It's filled with non-Mexican people eating delicious Mexican food. So I got lots of carbohydrates that way. But also Subway turned out to be a real blessing. There's a Subway in almost every medium-sized town in the United States. And I would find it, go to it, order a foot-long turkey stuffed with vegetables. I'd eat half right then and then save the other half for later on. So what did I do at night? After all that riding and eating, I camped, motels, stayed with family and friends, and I used a service called Warm Showers. I was in some absolutely beautiful campgrounds with glorious sunsets. I'll show you some more pictures of that later. But in the lower right-hand corner, this was a campground on just about 5 miles off the Erie Canal in western New York State. And a bunch of happy campers. When I rolled into this campground, I had my first mistake, a hard lesson about not having thought through where I was going to get dinner. An interesting thing about the Erie Canal path is that there's all these little towns along the Erie Canal, but they really amount to nothing. They're dead towns because, the canal doesn't have commercial traffic. The railroad line that goes through doesn't stop. It's, the big freight trains. So if there's anything in some of these towns, it's a Dollar General with no really edible food. So I ended up in this campground not having bought any dinner, hoping that the camp office had some, some meals of some sort. Nah, nothing, just snacks. I set up my tent, took a shower, and when I came back, there was this couple standing looking at my touring bike. And they wanted to bicycle tour. So they were filled with questions. And before I knew it, I was over at their RV having dinner with them, telling them about my trip so far. So that was a recurrent event. If there was some problem I had, it immediately got solved by all the wonderful people I ran into. I did stay in motels, sometimes when it rained, sometimes when it was too hot, particularly out west. This surf motel was in this little dive of a town along the Lake Erie between Erie and Cleveland. And it had started raining, so I went in there. The motel owner bragged to me about the $13,000 fine he had to pay the previous summer because of COVID violations for all the bikers. And it wasn't bicyclists, it was the other type of bikers that came through. Staying in a motel was a big relief a lot of times because it started with a shower and air conditioning, feet up, a nap, and then dinner. Yeah, motels are great things. Doesn't matter how rundown they are. I also stayed with Warm Showers hosts. So Warm Showers, and you should look it up, it's an international organization throughout Europe and South America and the United States, Canada, of bicyclists who, when they're home, they host bicyclists on the road. So I stayed with this guy on the left side. He's a community college teacher in San Diego, and he and his wife have a retirement home in Missoula, Montana. I stayed with this couple in a really nice renovated Civil War era house in an old section of Cleveland. I did this 5 times. I had a warm shower every time. Only once did I not have a guest bed, but I always had breakfast or dinner. My favorite campsites were 2 of them. On the lower left corner, this is in Allen, Kansas, along the Flint Hills Trail in eastern Kansas. It was a private campsite purchased and set up with water and electricity by a Rails to Trails fan, a bicyclist in Kansas City by the name of Darius Riley. I had just arrived. Maybe 15 minutes later, a bunch of deer walked across the far side of the campsite. As the sun was going down, the sky turned pink with big cumulus clouds drifting by. As the sun went down, there were fireflies everywhere. After I lay down in my tent and looked out, the stars were just shining bright. It was quiet. And then in the morning, the meadowlarks and the red-winged blackbirds woke me up. It was just astoundingly beautiful. In the upper right corner was my last camp night along the Nehalem River in the Oregon coastal hills at the Henry Ryerson campground. It was in the midst of Douglas firs and pines and birch trees. There was a steep drop on a dirt path down to the river where I sat on rocks and had a sponge bath and then came up. And as I was lying there waiting to go to sleep, I was looking up and the sky was absolutely clear. I had this hole in the tree canopy where I could watch the stars and shooting stars go through. And at that moment, I was wishing that the trip was not going to come to an end the next day. Every day was a new adventure. I had one objective: get to my destination safely with enough water and food. I didn't have to worry about what was going to happen in between, except for a few times. And I knew that it was going to be something interesting and I was going to meet interesting people. And this picture in the center is a 4-story ramp that goes from the Missouri River and the Katy Trail up to Jefferson City, the downtown section of Jefferson City in Missouri. And people were out walking this and bicycling this. It was the most amazing ramp. I've got a video of going around it. This lower picture is crossing the Mississippi River between Alton, Illinois and St. Charles on my way to St. Louis. These are big river barges that go down the Mississippi, or in this case, up the Mississippi, either hauling wheat or coal, or I think this one was empty. So it's 3 rows across and about 4 or 5 wide. So 20 or so barges being pushed up by this tugboat. While I was leaving Jefferson City on the right-hand side, I was told that the race across America was coming through. So I waited, and sure enough, here comes the lead racer. The race across America takes place every year, and it goes from San Diego to Annapolis, Maryland. This guy had spent the night bicycling through Kansas and was now on his way through Missouri. These guys ride about 20 miles, 20 hours, 22 hours a day. They only sleep for short periods of time. It's like a 6 or 7 day crossing from San Diego to Annapolis. The scenery, as you can imagine, 4,400 miles. It was just endless scenery of mountains, trails, prairies, rivers, small towns, back roads. I can't emphasize enough back roads. It makes such a difference being off the interstate. And the sky, endless sky scenes. This tree was someplace, I think in Western Massachusetts. The thing must have been 30 feet around in circumference. It's lost its top, but it's still alive. I would guess it's at least 200 years old, maybe 300. The east, of course, was just deep greens, short horizons, old places. Farming silos, old tobacco barns in Connecticut. You can see a haze in this scene. This was someplace in Connecticut or central Massachusetts. My mother grew up on a farm and she was always identifying plants. And when I rode past this, I thought that must be rye. I've got an app in my phone, so I looked it up and sure enough, it was ryegrass. You can see the little haze of all the pollen being blown off. And then when I was out in south of Chicago in Illinois, I went through a prairie grass preserve where they have buffalo, and it turns out they also have cattle, and these were young cattle. I made a little bit of a mistake. It had rained before I got here, and as you'll hear, my brakes were squeaky. Oh, this is going to be interesting. Hello, how are you guys? Mind if I come through? Needless to say, I scared the calves, and they all decided to congregate on the road. So I had to get off the path and go around them. It was a lesson in thinking ahead, maybe. Of course, when I got into the Rockies, it was filled with rocks and mountains and streams and endless sky, the endless sky. In the lower left corner, this is an interesting geological feature in the Bighorn Mountains. It's a national parkland, and this sign says it's a granite mafic dike from the Precambrian era, and it's 2.3 million years old. So it's referring to this section up here. This is a piece of lava that had forced its way through some other geology. The other rock had eroded around it, but this stuff being igneous had lasted this long time. They had these kinds of signs all along this route, about a 60-mile route across the Bighorn Mountains. It was fascinating stuff. Those are very old mountains. This was on the other side of the Bighorn Mountains. I'll show you a video going down that. And I think this was a river in Yellowstone. Rivers and more rivers. The lower left-hand corner, I'm looking east from about Hood River along the Columbia River or the Gorge just west of Portland. Here I was swimming in a stream in Missoula, Montana, and this was a stream that was running down some mountain pass that I've forgotten. I went swimming in as many of those streams as I could, or at least cooled off my feet. This odd picture, it's real, was on the road that goes up to the east entrance of Yellowstone out of Cody, Wyoming. It was about a 80-mile ride that my riding companions and I broke into 2 days. But leaving Cody, Wyoming along the way before we really started climbing, there were a whole bunch of these bizarre statues that someone had just put out in the middle of their hay fields. Of course, the mountains were equally as interesting. This next one is a video of where I'm descending on the west side of the Bighorn Mountains. It was a 6,000-foot drop over 30 miles. There was no traffic. It was a perfect day. The temperature was about maybe 75, 80 degrees. There was no wind. The sky was completely clear. I'm going about 35 miles per hour here, just gliding along, enjoying the beautiful scenery. This was probably the best of the rides. There were a couple of others that were close. I had some riding companions with me at this point. Nature, of course, over 4,400 miles, you see lots of nature. This was a Douglas fir tree. Here's the old tree, and here's a young tree growing up out of its roots. This was on the trail in the coastal hills of Western Oregon on my way to the Pacific. This strange tree growing out of an abandoned silo was, I think, someplace in Illinois. And these rocks, these are sandstone rocks that have been, where the sandstone has been glued together, if I understand it, the geology correctly, by calcimite. This was in central Kansas, close to where my parents grew up. As a kid, we visited here all the time. There's about 200 of these rocks spread over this state park, but these are the largest ones. As you may know, Kansas and Oklahoma, Nebraska were the ocean bed, were the bed of an ocean hundreds of millions of years ago. And these rocks were in that ocean bed, but while everything else eroded away, they have remained standing like this. Just one more of the interesting things of nature. I told you earlier that I rode nearly 2,000 miles of trails. So the first 3 trails that I had in Massachusetts and Connecticut, then a trail up the Connecticut River Valley, up towards Albany, and then at Schenectady, getting on the Erie Canal Path to Buffalo. And then south of Kalamazoo, Michigan, down to South Bend, Indiana, I rode trails off and on all the way over to the Illinois-Michigan Canal south of Chicago that I rode to my hometown. I rode a trail that went, the Rock Island Trail down into Peoria. That was a spectacular trail. And then in St. Louis, I got on the Katy Trail that follows the Missouri River almost to Kansas City. And then I got on the Flint Country Trail that goes through eastern Kansas out to Salina, Kansas. And then I rode most of the Cowboy Trail in northern Nebraska, an old railroad line, and then the Mickelson Trail through the south, through the Black Hills of South Dakota, a little bit of trail around Missoula, Montana, and then the Route 30 trail that runs from Hood River, Oregon, almost all the way to Portland. It's partly trail, partly railroad line, partly old highway. And then the Crown-Zellerbach Trail from Portland out to almost to Seaside. Here I am getting on the Erie Canal Path. Here in the middle of the Mickelson Trail in South Dakota is a bicycle sculpture of bicycles that have been welded together. And in this video, I'm on my last trail, the Crown-Zellerbach. This was just trees filled with moss, lots of birds. I didn't see any wild animals like I did other places. I'm sure they were hiding from me. The trails were just a phenomenal experience. The eastern trails were filled with old structures, bridges, limestone bluffs along the Missouri River, along the Erie Canal, locks, through Illinois, and going through the middle of cornfields that were old railroad lines. And then this is the Illinois-Michigan Canal coming into my hometown.
Well, imagine this, having fun on a barge boat on a Sunday in the Illinois-Michigan Canal. Is this the way to Oregon? I just came from Boston. And look at this, he's being pulled by a mule. Well, I guess there's money in history. All right. Well, man.
The Western trails were equally interesting. Here we are in the Mickelson Trail, having to go through gates because it's open grazing land. So there were some cattle out wandering around. Here I am on the trail between Hood River and Portland. I had to go up 3 flights of stairs with my heavily laden bicycle, but fortunately they cut bicycle wheel paths through this old cement, so you had something to wheel on other than the steps. On the Mickelson Trail, there were 4 old railroad tunnels to go through. On the Meadowlark Trail, there was a covered bridge to go under. Here we are in the Mickelson Trail, and this is the Katy Trail along the Missouri River.
Missouri, bed and breakfasts, children's parks, and now I'm crossing probably the Roche River, heading through a tunnel carved out of the limestone bluffs. I wish I had my drone operating. It's be an incentive, because the limestone bluffs around here are just incredibly huge. And they're right along the Missouri River. This is unbelievably beautiful country.
Sometimes the beauty was so, it just put me into a state of ecstasy. I think it was a combination of the endomorphins that were being generated by bicycling and the sheer beauty of nature. Occasionally it was aided and abetted by some other substances, but I was having some glorious moments. The open road was equally wonderful and beautiful. Because I was taking back roads, it was low traffic, especially out west. Usually there were sufficient shoulders, but the drivers were all attentive and considerate, except in Yellowstone when the big motorhome drivers would get up behind you. This little picture right here, I got off the Katy Trail at one point. I needed to get out from under the dark canopy of the trees, and I came across this burning pile of hay bales that were on a trailer that had overturned. And my farming cousin said, yeah, that was probably a spontaneous combustion. It happens a lot, and they're very difficult to put out. Just past the fire truck were a whole bunch of Mennonites who were watching the fire, and I'm guessing it was maybe their hay truck. The weather was constantly interesting. I had just left a campground in central Illinois and was headed for a small town to get breakfast.
Ah, the great Midwest. I'm being chased by a cold front that's collided with the hot front that came up the other day. It's threatening to dump some drizzle on me. Watching it closely, I don't want any little tornado spouts dropping down. Unlikely. But I'm on my way. I took a day off yesterday in Crazy Horse Campground to rest from the heat of Thursday. I'll make it most of the way to St. Louis today. Cheers.
So that video doesn't do the clouds quite justice. They were really roiling, just constantly turning over, and this thing was coming at me. In fact, I had 10 miles to get to this little town, and I didn't make it before I'd been dumped on by buckets of rain 3 times. I arrived in this little town. I found a breakfast joint to eat at. I took some dry clothes in and changed in the bathroom and sat down. And the restaurant was filled with all these farming people, workers, farming families, retirees, children, and they were all talking shop about the drought that they'd been going through. They hadn't had rain for nearly a month. There were 4 guys sitting at one table who finally got up long after they'd finished their breakfast, and someone in the crowd yelled out, "Now don't get wet out there." Everybody in the restaurant laughed because, of course, 1, they were going to get wet, and 2, everyone was happy that they were going to get wet. It was an interesting scene.
Ah, the great.
More of the open road on the left side. This is a limestone fence post out in central Kansas on the property my mother grew up on. Because they didn't have a lot of trees, they had lots of limestone. They cut these fence posts, and they're still standing out there. This was eastern Washington with all this wheat on the side being ready to get cut. Sun coming up. Here's a wheat field where it hasn't been cut. And this gravel road was about 30 miles of road up to this tiny little rundown town called Grant, Montana. It was over a pass that we were headed on our route, and we were supposed to go over another pass that was even higher into another valley. But the woman in the restaurant we stopped in at around noon said, "You don't want to go up there because the smoke is so bad that you'll get smoke inhalation exhaustion." The air quality was about 150 to 160. This is about the same time that you were getting all that smoke here from Oregon.
The vistas in central Kansas are so beautiful.
This next slide is riding north towards South Dakota, towards the Black Hills, out of western Nebraska. On both sides of the road, it's the Ogallala National Prairie Grassland Preserve. And it just went on for mile after mile like this, with all of these little ponds along the way that during the spring and the fall are filled with migratory birds. It's just an absolutely spectacular stretch of prairie that's just natural. You can imagine what it was like for the settlers that were heading out on the Oregon Trail to pass through these lands. More magic. Yellowstone. I bicycled with my friends through Yellowstone. Of course, if any of you visited Yellowstone, it's just it's an endless beauty, endless interesting things. As I was just coming up the road out of the eastern entrance to Yellowstone, there was this buffalo just standing along the side of the road, just as still as could be. I don't think I would have seen him if I'd been in a car. I stopped for a moment and he didn't move. I'll show you some more buffalo pictures a little bit later. Here's the beautiful valleys, the streams, and then a geyser, not a geyser, but a steamer. You know, the Yellowstone geology is so interesting. It's always sort of amazing to think that it's basically sitting on top of an ancient extinct volcano. People, every day I met new people. Our country is just filled with wonderful, kind, caring, helpful, considerate, interesting people. We just have astonishing diversity in this country. This was Michelle. She stopped her lunch break in a salon in Kansas, in Salina, Kansas, when no place was open. I really needed a haircut badly. And we had a fabulous time talking. I asked her what it was like growing up Mexican-American in central Kansas. And she said, she just had a wonderful childhood and she's got this wonderful business that she's running. This guy served me sticky rice and some of the best pad thai I've ever had. He's from Laos. We shared stories. He came over as a child from a refugee, and I told him about my having worked in a refugee camp in Thailand, and he spent time in a different camp. He's got his little restaurant in Grand Island, Nebraska, where he's been living for the past 35 years. This guy I sat down next to in a diner in Eastern Washington, and he immediately struck up friendship and started drawing my picture. He was a great guy. He just was a nonstop talker. This fellow, I crossed the bridge from Washington over the Columbia River into Oregon, and it was a busy bridge with very narrow shoulders, and he had just come across from his camp under the bridge, where he's been living for the past 5 years, to go to the service station in the Oregon side. He was very nice, very chatty. We had a little conversation, and I needless to say, I emptied my wallet. He was living in rags. This fellow right down at the bottom, I was bicycling through southeastern Michigan on rural dirt roads, and I kept seeing this little figure hopping in and out of the drainage dishes. And when I finally came up alongside him and stopped and started talking with him, it turns out he was picking wild asparagus. And I asked him, I said, you know, that's an interesting agricultural piece of equipment there, that bicycle. And he said, yeah, it's the only thing that he has to get around. He lives about 5 miles off the road and he can't afford a car. A little bit later, I was listening to a podcast by the Warren Cars, and this transportation expert noted that there's a higher percentage of people who do not own cars that live in small towns and rural America than in urban America. And they're very dependent on bicycles. This fellow, Mr. Singh, yeah, well, I'll start the video. He and I had this very circular conversation.
Your plaza is so clean and neat. Are you making a living here?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
I live in the
Yes.
city, 10 miles from here.
My name's Alan.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
I appreciate it.
Yes.
Okay. So,
It's, you know, this is what makes America great.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. You can come back.
So he came over 35 years ago with his wife and 2 young sons. His sons are both engineers now. One works in Wichita, Kansas, and the other in New Jersey. And the sons had gone to a zoo, which bizarrely is in the middle of Kansas, which is just down the road from this service plaza. The service plaza was run down and up for sale, so the sons bought it for their father. He and his wife live there. They have turned this service station into this really nice, clean place. I stopped to talk to him because he was out sweeping the cement apron at the entrance to his service plaza. He treated me to a soda and some chips. And I asked him, knowing that this was rural Kansas, how well he got along with the locals. And they said that they love him because the service plaza before that was run down and dirty and everything. And now it's this great place where they all come to. It just was striking to me the number of different people, the diversity across our country as I rode. Including these 2 guys from Somalia in the lower left corner. I was struggling to get through Buffalo. They've ripped up the entire riverfront along Buffalo, and all of my GPS mapping was not working. So I stopped to get some lunch in this little Middle Eastern place. And these guys were in there eating lunch and told me what I should order. So I started talking with them, and I asked them, I said, I'm afraid to ask this, are you guys Ethiopian? Because I recognized their accents. And they laughed and said, no, we're Somalis. Ethiopia and Eritrea are just political divisions. And so then I said, well, you know, how do you like living in Buffalo, it being so cold? And they went on and on about how much they love living in America, that in America you can do anything and be anything that you want. And they said, you know, we can cross the state boundary here and we don't have to worry about getting shot at. I thought it was an interesting thing for them to say. This is a window showing you the inside of a wall that was built with hay bales in the middle of western Nebraska. This little grocery store in a little town that only had a service station that sold junk food. And this is the school principal. She and her students and other teachers started this project 10 years ago. The students organized the building of this store. The students order the food, run the cash register, and they did this in order to attract students from the other towns. You know, these towns are so small that they can hardly support a school. So they need to bring students in from other little towns nearby. You know, nearby is a relative term, 20 miles or something. The students in this project have presented in the state capitol in Lincoln, Nebraska, and in Washington, D.C., their project. It was just an example of how Americans are so rich in their ability to be creative and to solve problems. The other thing that I experienced was seeing lots and lots of Amish and Mennonites. You've probably read some of the stories about how with their large families, they're out buying up old used farmland and turning it back into productivity. So this was a Sunday afternoon on a gravel road someplace in Ohio where an Amish buggy caught up with me. So I caught up to their gathering place, and it was interesting. You know, it was sort of it wasn't a church. It looked sort of like a Grange Hall or something. And the adults were all up at the hall, and then sprinkled out around the side were all of these buggies with young Amish standing around talking with each other. I didn't take a picture. They saw me coming, and they called out no photography. But I did get that rolling through, and I had multiple experiences like this. Here, I had just bought, this is in Kansas, I had just bought some ripe plums from this brother and sister. The younger brother just kept glaring at me as though he was afraid that I was going to somehow violate something. I don't know. Animals. Of course, on a long trip like that, there's endless animals, mules, elk in Yellowstone. I saw lots of bighorn sheep, but none of them for very long, not long enough to get a picture of. So I had to get this taxidermied head in a little restaurant in Montana. Along the Katy Trail in Missouri, there was a warning sign about keeping your food secure because of black bears. That got me worried, and I started seeing poop and imagining things. But there were lots of these big poops out on the trail, and they clearly weren't from cows because there weren't any cows. They weren't horse poop. They know what that looks like, and they weren't. So I just had to wonder, with all the grass and berry seeds in them, if maybe they were bear poop. And the trail at that point was very enclosed in a canopy of trees, and it was late afternoon, and there was nobody out. And my imagination just took off with me. So I kept ringing my bell to scare the bears away. Needless to say, it wasn't a problem. This buffalo was grazing about 50 feet from our campground off of Lake Yellowstone. There were a couple of them out there. You know, they're just big grass vacuums. That's all they do. In Wyoming, I kept trying to get pictures of mule deers that would just suddenly spring up and run along the road, and I finally got this one. You'll see the deer in the lower right-hand corner here in a moment. And notice how it's springing up and down on all four legs. It doesn't run like you would think a horse would run. It's just bouncing along. They were everywhere out there. They would go along, and then they would suddenly turn and just leap over those fences. This one, for some reason, didn't do that. It was as though it was trying to get on the other side of the road, and kept being confused by my presence. Birds. I wish I had a lot more birds pictures. It's really hard to get pictures of birds. They just, appear and suddenly disappear, and they're out of focus. Especially in Western Montana, there were lots of big birds. These are not birds. These are statues of owls to keep the osprey and the hawks off these high tension power lines. There were lots of poles along this river. It was a river in Western Wyoming where there were lots of osprey and eagles and hawks. Here's a bald eagle that was also in Missouri, but it was interesting. This was in Grafton, Illinois, just north of St. Louis. I guess a wintering place for bald eagles. And I did get a picture of this osprey hovering around its nest. In fact, it was being chased by smaller birds. sheep, goats, cows, snapping turtles, cranes down in the canals. And this was a mud wallow along the Cowboy Trail in northern Nebraska. And I sort of screwed up this video, but it's still interesting to watch.
What we got here is a big old wallow. You can see the cows over there out edging into the little pond. And it continues on to the other side of this Cowboy Trail. Oh. Cows decided they didn't like my presence, so we got up and left. Quite a rush.
Western Nebraska was just filled with these little ponds. And as I mentioned, it's a place where the migratory birds go through. In fact, there were red-winged blackbirds and meadowlarks all along there. It was just a luscious environment. Oops. Sorry, I was supposed to give people warning. This next slide might be a little disturbing. It's pictures of dead animals. I want to just talk briefly about that. If it is upsetting to you, then look aside or turn off your screen for a moment. We're all used to seeing roadkill when we're driving out on our cars, but the thing that's different about bicycling is that you not only really see them, but you also smell them. It was everything, amphibious, from snakes to frogs to turtles to mammals like rabbits and raccoons and fox and deer to a badger. This was a bloated up badger out someplace in the West, and birds, just lots of birds. But as I was thinking about, all of this roadkill, I realized that I was not only just seeing them, but I was also smelling them without seeing them. And that made me think, and this deer confirmed it, that there was a lot of roadkill out there that I was not seeing, that these are animals that get struck by cars and trucks and they're injured and they crawl off to the side of the road where they die. And that made me think that I would guess that there's probably more animals killed that we don't see than those that we do see. And that made me think about articles I read over the past couple of years about how the animal population in the world is declining. And the scientists attribute it to several things: climate change, drought, the encroachment on habitat by humans. But I would also suspect that the 3 to 4 billion cars and trucks in the world are killing an awful lot of animals. I'm sure there's someone out there who's done a research project on this and has statistics on how many more animals get killed than we see, but it must be a major contribution. Contribution's maybe not quite the right word. Despite our love of cars and trucks, we also have a love for bicycles. There was just an endless scene of bicycles everywhere. Bicycles turned into mailboxes, bicycles along the trails welcoming people. This strange three-wheeled front-wheel drive bicycle outside a motel in Nebraska, a bicycle in a Kansas farm with a monkey on board, some antique John Deere bicycles. These are from the 1970s that this orchard guy had out in his parking lot. I told him that those were very valuable, and he said he knew that. There were also electric bikes everywhere. As many of you know, I'm a big advocate for electric bicycling. I was thinking I wouldn't see as many as I see in Boston. In fact, I saw more. I saw more electric bicycles in rural areas than I did in the cities. This was an electric folding bicycle in front of a farmhouse. This woman in central Nebraska was selling breakfast burritos out of her trike that had an electric motor on it. Here's a couple in Great Barrington dropping $4,000 on 2 electric bicycles because the bicycle shop didn't have any regular bicycles to sell. I kept seeing and talking with more and more motorhome people about the fact that instead of hauling a car behind their RV, they had chosen electric bicycles because it did what they needed. This was an electric trike that a couple from Montana, she was handicapped. They're touring around the state parks, and she could follow him on his mountain bike, riding the trails in the state parks. This was a guy in South Bend who had an electric folding bike that he was taking a break on his way to work. And this fellow was along the Erie Canal path. He was coming out of the Dollar General. I recognized his cargo bike. He was stuffing his cargo bags with groceries and stuff. And I swooped down to talk to him and ask him. And he had 2 batteries hooked up to his bike. And I said, you know, why 2 batteries and why an electric bike? And he said, well, he retired a couple of years ago. He can't afford a car. He lives 15 miles out of town and he needs 2 batteries in order to make it in to get provisions. I met lots and lots of bicyclists. Here I was in the Erie Canal. This fellow on the right sold his business 8 years, and he spends the winter living in Tucson, Arizona. And come April, he gets on the road on his bicycle and goes to some new place. He was on his way to Bar Harbor. This fellow is from Worcester. He helped to start the Earn a Bike program in Worcester. He was riding an old 1970s clunker on his way to Pittsburgh to a wedding. This was on the Katy Trail in Missouri on a particularly hot and humid day. This couple was on their way to Iowa to ride the Ragbri, the great ride across Iowa. And they were having gin and tonics. I had half a gin and tonic with them, and I stopped after I realized it was going to ruin my ability to get to my destination about 30 miles away. This couple was riding out to Chicago, and they had fancy gear and fancy riding clothes. They were all set to roll. As I was leaving, the fellow in the red shirt handed me a gummy and said, "Here, this will make the rest of your ride more enjoyable." This was Neil, one of my riding companions. We rode through Wyoming and Western Montana together when we split up there. And this is Paco and Erica. They're from Mexico City. And I ran across them in Western Nebraska. I was feeling a little lonely, and the fates sent me them to be companions for a while.
So I'm having this really surreal experience. There's someone on a bicycle in front of me. And this time I don't have to tell them they're going the wrong way. I thought I was the only crazy person in the world, but I guess not. Not only that, but there's 2 of them. Oh my God. Hi, my name's Alan. Atha.
So they were on their way to Seattle. We rode together. They were just sort of riding day to day, making up their plans as they went along. And I told them about the Mickelson Trail. They hadn't stayed in a motel for 3 weeks. They just had outdoor showers where available. They'd been at campsites. So I treated them to a motel room and dinner that night. And they decided to ride with me through on the Mickelson Trail through the Black Hills. And in the middle of the Mickelson Trail, we ran into Neil. And so the 4 of us rode across Wyoming and into Yellowstone together. We had a great time, a lot of partying together.
So I'm happy.
I've met lots of other bicycle tourists. There are a lot of people out there that are riding the open road. There were women going east in Nebraska on supported groups following Route 20. There were women riding alone through Yellowstone. There were men alone in groups. Paul was on his way to Minneapolis after having gone around the world for the past 4 years. He put me to shame. He had so little gear with him, and I had way too much gear. I kept sending packages home, learning that I didn't use this. For example, I never used my cook stove, so I finally sent it home. I gave stuff away. This fellow is from Attleboro, Massachusetts. He was heading east, raising money for an ALS foundation. This fellow had just left Yellowstone and was on his way to the Black Hills. And I was the first bicyclist he met. He had lots of questions for me, and And I suggested to him at one point that he might want to lose weight, and he took it personally. And when I realized, I said, no, I mean, you could get rid of things. For example, you don't need that bear spray because you're now out of the Rockies. So he gave me the bear spray, which I gave to my Mexico City companions. This fellow was riding the Great Divide Trail that runs from Banff, Canada, all the way down to Mexico, following the Great Divide along forest roads, along trails. It's an amazing thing. And he had to drop down because the smoke was so bad in western Montana. He had to get out of the smoke. This fellow I met on Amtrak, he was wearing a T-shirt from Laos, which caused me to ask him why he was wearing that T-shirt. I worked in a refugee camp in Thailand for 2 years, so I recognized the Lao flag. Well, lo and behold, not only did we have that experience together, he'd been a reporter in Bangkok for a decade, but he was on his 9th month of bicycling around the United States. We spent 2 days talking nonstop on Amtrak. So my next topic is farming. I visited my farming relatives in Kansas. My parents grew up on farms in Kansas. Here's some winter wheat in western Massachusetts that was maybe a month away from harvesting. Here was the winter wheat in Kansas. By the time I arrived there, it was ready for harvesting. Some places they'd had a little too much rain, so the farmers were nervous, but my cousins were ready to farm. And I got up into the combine with my cousin Steve. These are amazing machines.
So what's your moisture content? This looks a little dark. Dark color, right? Around 12 and a half, 13. Uh-huh.
So these enormous machines, this is the front of a harvester without the blades attached, costs $250,000, $300,000. The whole cutting apparatus is another $150,000, $200,000. These farmers have $2, $3, $4, $5 million in capital equipment. If they're leasing land, they've got even more expenses than that. These guys, they own about 3,000 to 4,000 acres, and then they lease some land, and then they sort of rent farm for some other absentee landlords. My cousin said to me that farming is the only business where you buy retail and sell wholesale. I would add also that it's probably one of the only businesses where you're completely at the mercy of the weather, and you're at the mercy of energy prices. They use diesel in all of this equipment, in these big John Deere tractors, in the big trucks that they own. They own semi-trailers to haul their crops from the fields, from the harvest, off to these silos. Here you can see a farmland in southwestern Ohio that was, or northwestern Ohio, that was just flooded out. There was lots of flooding along there. There'd been a lot of rain earlier. This guy was farming about 500 acres in central Illinois, but he had branched out because he said he needed some additional cash crop. So he had covered this whole field in plastic, and all of those little red things are where he was growing mums, flowers. He also had a corn maze and some other things to attract people around Halloween. Lots and lots of irrigation the further out west you get, and lots of irrigation in Nebraska.
cousins in north central Kansas live, this part of Nebraska just seems to have endless amounts of water. Must have something to do with the Ogallala aquifer.
So vast areas of the West are getting drier and drier. I just will say that central Nebraska just seemed to have an enormous amount of water. Lots of family, farming family in Kansas, my brother and his grandchildren out in Portland, Oregon, my nephews, my sister and her kids. And this is my cousin Norman. He's about 84 years old. And he's just going to tell a little story here from 1934 when he was a child and his father lost the family farm.
They lost it. When your folks moved in here in 34? Yeah, they lost the farm that they bought there north of Beverly. My dad tells me that he was in the bank one day. I forget the banker's name. I used to know where it was. He says, Niles, you're going to have to foreclose. Dad says, no, you're not. I'm going home to get the deed. Just give it to me. He was broke. They was broke. And they knew this place was for rent. Because my great grandmother was still alive and she owned it. And they moved up here in 34. And I heard Dad tell about all the belongings he had. He loaded up on a hay rack and a box wagon.
So what he finished by telling is that his father, my uncle, loaded up two wagon carts with horses pulling, and they rode 60 miles in one day with their furniture and the family and equipment and other stuff being pulled by those horses up the back roads up to where his wife's grandparents had a farm that was available for them to rent. They started all over again. It was during the Depression. It was a remarkable story to hear. We're an endlessly creative people. I have so many pictures of very interesting and bizarre sculptures and just all kinds of creations. I don't remember where this was. It's a mailbox made out of old tractor parts. This was in eastern Washington along a river valley. This belt right here is a belt probably from a tractor. Some guy had made this dragon. This was the entranceway to a house that had warning signs all over it that if you went past the gate, you were going to get shot. There was all kinds of metal sculptures around the entranceway. This was bales or windings of barbed wire. This was in Kansas. These two balls of barbed wire were wound up and were sitting on top of limestone fence posts. Interesting sculpture. This house, and I had my phone on the maximum zoom, was sitting on top of a hill on the road that was on the east entrance, towards the east entrance to Yellowstone. It was this biggest, most bizarre house. It was something like out of a science fiction movie. This was an old cabin in western Montana that just had all of these old skulls around it. It had paintings and things along the side, old wagon wheels. There's just an amazing amount of old stuff out in the dry land that just hasn't deteriorated. I bicycled through this tiny little town in northern Kansas. I mean, there was nothing there other than a gas station and a little post office, but the town was filled with all of this artwork of sunflowers and birds. And I stopped and asked one of the guys at the gas station. And he said, yeah, we got this artist woman around here who just keeps making these things and putting them up. That fellow that I showed you earlier that was planting the mums in Illinois for a harvest festival, he had created this praying mantis out of different old farm implement parts. And this was mid-June. So by the time the corn had grown 10, 12 feet high, only the top part of the praying mantis was going to be showing. Signs. We love to signal to each other, just all kinds of signs of every kind that you can imagine. An awful lot of angry signs, I have to say, though. And a lot of those signs were in the political direction. This sign was in Connecticut near Windsor Locks. It was a little disturbing to read. Someone was calling for the military to force a new election. This sign was just across the Montana border saying, "Save Montana, close the state borders." Good luck with that. I thought this was interesting. Farmers for Trump, but in fact, I guess this guy was voting for Jesus in 2020. This sign was interesting in, decrying socialism, but I took that picture from a state highway that ran in front of the house, and it made me think, I wonder if the guy realizes that publicly owned roads are another form of socialism. A lot of angry signs. Social distancing is defined by liberals and the Democrats. Signs warning you that if you step over the line, you're going to get shot. No trespassing, and violators will be shot, with survivors shot a second time. Come and get it. AK-47 signs. This sign in someplace in Wyoming informing us that everything that Dr. Fauci has to say are all lies. It was a little disturbing to see how much of this there was, and it was mostly in the rural areas, though in small towns as well. But there was another sign, and that was the sign of our tragic commons. As I was coming into the suburbs of Cleveland, I was struck, not literally struck, I was struck by the fact that all of these puppets tied to this pole, which was close to an elementary school, were stuffed animals. And it made me realize that there must have been a child that ran across this 4-lane road and got killed. This ghost bicycle was at the crossing of a trail across a road. This sign was out on a rural road in front of a farmhouse, miles and miles away from the nearest town. And the owner had to put this up to say to the drivers, "Stop driving like jerks." It just struck me that in order to be safe as a pedestrian or a bicyclist some places, you have to walk with a friend. And it made me think that in some ways we're sort of driving ourselves to death. The West is dominated with diesel trucks, many of them, of course, essential trucks for all of the work that is done out there, but an awful lot of motorhomes, just endless miles of motorhomes. And you can see this was a KOA campground in Western Montana. We had to divert and ride up the interstate because we couldn't ride up into the passes up in the hills because the smoke was so bad. The sun was going down, and you can see how hazy the sky is from all of the fires that were going on. And I just kept thinking about how all of these diesel burning motorhomes are contributing to climate change. This was a group in Wyoming. It was 4 big Jeeps, and there was some SUVs pulling horse trailers. I guess this family, and I think they were from New York based on their accents, were going to go horseback riding up into the Black Hills. We stayed in a little town in Montana in this little motel, and I woke up in the morning to the sounds of this diesel truck with the exhaust coming in the window of our little cabin. This truck ran for about 45 minutes before the owner finally came out. I was afraid to go around and knock on doors and ask for the person to turn it off. He just ignored me when I pointed out that he had made the entire parking area just filled with diesel smoke. There's just a seeming lack of awareness of the consequences of our using fossil fuels. In fact, the West is filled with fossil fuel infrastructure, and not just the West. This is an electricity plant in Ohio, where coal trains were coming in and supplying coal. This was a plant, I think an ethanol plant in western Nebraska. These are oil storage tank. These oil donkeys are everywhere in Kansas, Nebraska, Wyoming, Montana.
Howdy, folks. This is what's called a dead-end donkey. Dead end because it's pumping up fossil fuels, which we will burn and put CO2 in the atmosphere to further wreck our planet. A donkey because, well, that should be kind of obvious. This one.
Now, that one looks like it's a couple of decades old, and in defense of the farmer whose land is being taken up, he's making a little bit of money, but probably not that much because probably the mineral rights are owned by the oil company around there. Wyoming and the Dakotas are the epicenter of carbon-based energy production. On the right-hand side, this is just outside Gillette, Wyoming, which bills itself as the energy capital of the world. Gillette, Wyoming is surrounded by open pit coal mines. This was a road in which one of those enormous monster trucks hauls coal from the open pit coal mine over to the loading facility where the trains get filled up. You can see this is the morning sun, and the sky reminded me of the sky of my childhood in the early 1960s before the environmental laws were passed. The sky, the air was just filled with coal dust and probably ozone from all the fracking wells that were also around there. This was in the Dakotas. This is a fracking processing plant. You can see that they're burning off natural gas instead of capturing it. This was the rail yard where they organized the coal trains. This is a picture from Google Earth, just east of Gillette, Wyoming. It's about 10 to 15 railroad lines across, and all of those thin lines are 100-car coal trains that are being organized to be taken to the coal plants in the Midwest and in the South. Here comes a coal train. There's an empty oil tanker, and these are all coal cars that are empty and heading back to probably back to Wyoming. These trains are 100, 110 cars long. There's endless numbers of them. One of the things about riding out in the West is that you're really sort of funneled into narrow corridors where there's lots of highways following the rivers and the railroads. And so you see these coal trains constantly. My friend from my hometown told me that many of these cars are in fact filled with very fine special limestone sand that is dug up in open pits out in central Illinois. And that sand is part of the liquid mix that they use to inject into the ground for the fracking wells. There's signs of climate change everywhere, but also signs of progress and opposition everywhere. Northwestern Ohio along the Lake Erie was filled with signs saying, say no to industrial wind farms. But in fact, the trees around there many of them were like this tree. The prevailing winds are so constant blowing into the Northeast that that's how the trees grow. This was in Wyoming, this little town of Grant, Wyoming. We came in and stopped in a restaurant around noon after bicycling with our face masks on that morning. This was as the day was setting, and we stayed in this little motel in that town because the motel owner said to us, you don't want to continue on your ride up into the pass into the next valley because the air quality is so bad. They had to rescue some hikers from the Great Divide hiking path up there, kind of like the Appalachian Trail. In eastern Washington, there were signs out through the hills saying, use caution, high fire danger. So, you know, here's the signs of distress and the drought everywhere, but then there's signs of progress with these wind turbine farms.
This is part of the Illinois River Valley wind farm close to Peoria, Illinois. These windmills are all up on a bluff up above the valley. So there's a steady wind blowing through here. The windmills have been built on farmers' land. As I remember, they got about $10,000 a year in leasing rights for this. Maybe I've got those numbers wrong.
So there were just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these wind turbines in central Illinois, in parts of Kansas, parts of Nebraska, Wyoming even, Montana, and lots of them, just ones that were even bigger along the Columbia River Gorge in Oregon and Washington. I saw trains hauling the bases and hauling the blades, you know, the blades that are just enormously long, special trucks hauling them. I talked with some guys in nearby where this one was filmed who were out working, and they were replacing ones that had been erected 10 to 15 years ago because the technology has so vastly improved that it's worthwhile taking the old ones down and putting new ones up. I asked these guys about the work, and they said it's great work. They're constantly working, traveling around different parts of the country, and said their companies are constantly hiring more and more people to do this work. I took Amtrak home. If you haven't taken Amtrak out west, I really encourage it. The trains are just absolutely beautiful. There's observation cars. From this car, we were looking out over the Columbia River, across the river into Oregon. This train, the Empire Builder, went through Glacier National Park. As you can see, there's not any glaciers on this part of the mountains. The glaciers in Glacier National Park are nearly come to an end. They're heavily melted. Where was this view? I forget. This was an old steam engine someplace in the Dakotas. And it was a little maddening. Amtrak does not own the rail lines. BNSF, Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroads, that is Warren Buffett, the investor, owns all those rail lines. So Amtrak has to wait for the freight trains to come through. Though in Western Oregon, the train went incredibly slow like this because the conductor told us that the rails were so hot that they were starting to warp. And if the train went too fast, it was at risk of derailing. I was bicycling faster than the train was at this point, but that didn't continue all the time, just for a little while. At one point, we were 3 hours behind schedule. So to conclude, my trip left me with some sobering but hopeful thoughts. The first is that we're in trouble. The rapid onset of climate change, the intense droughts that have been happening, the fires out west. For the first time ever, the federal government this summer had to restrict the water taken out of the Colorado River in ways that they've never done before. A lot of the water in the Colorado River is used to generate hydroelectricity, and that hydroelectricity is used to power towns like, Phoenix, Arizona. And as that condition gets worse, when people are using more electricity for air conditioning, the extreme weather, I didn't see extreme rainfall or storms like we've been having in the East Coast, but it's clear that climate change is disrupting the communities and the economy. The Montana state fisheries had to restrict fishing in the rivers this summer. Angling fishermen coming out as a big part of the tourist economy in Montana. And now they're having to restrict it because the water levels are getting so low and it's harming the fish. There's a lot of fear and resistance out there in the country to the necessary and unavoidable change that is coming our way. We've got to find ways to help people understand that we are a strong, diverse, and caring people. We've got lots of resources and talent and ability to work together. We've just got to figure out how to get past our political divisions. And we all have to start making individual sacrifices for the benefit of all. 30% of CO2 emissions are from transportation, with most of that coming from cars and small trucks. Those farmers that I showed you, they need diesel engines. I don't think batteries are going to power those harvesters anytime soon. But those of us that live in the cities and the suburbs, we need to start using public transportation and bicycling. I just converted a manual bicycle to electric for a Boston school teacher this week, and she's just thrilled because she can now get to her school over in Dorchester from Jamaica Plain in 20 minutes instead of having to worry about driving or taking an hour to get there by bus and subway. We have the solutions, including one which is putting a price on carbon. Right now, we don't pay the costs of putting CO2 in the atmosphere, and because of that, the economy is not responding in the ways that it needs to provide us with the means to get off of fossil fuels. There is a city that's doing a lot more than many other cities. This is the light rail bridge and pedestrian and bicycle bridge across the Willamette River in Portland, Oregon. It's a beautiful bridge. It's filled with bicyclists going across and pedestrians and the light rail. This is our friend Paula, who used to live in Roslindale, riding her electric trike to go get groceries. She rode it all year round. She was 84 when I took this video of her. She'd given up driving years before because she, wasn't confident in her ability. This is downtown Portland, which has put light rail in throughout the downtown. Portland is filled with bicycle routes and lots of great pedestrian infrastructure. I did note, however, that a lot of people drive. And when I asked locals about that, they said, Portland is just not a very dense city. There's not a lot of, the roads aren't heavily filled with traffic. It's very easy to drive. You never have to worry about parking. But they have put the infrastructure in there for people to take advantage of. So thank you very much for attending my talk. I documented my trip on Twitter at Alan Bike Climate. I'm going to pick up the conversation again there, and I'd love for you to add to it. If you've got a group that you would like, I would be happy to repeat this. As we mentioned earlier, Talia did record this, so that's going to be available. You can contact me at this email address. And if you're interested in supporting some of the organizations that I support, tops of my list is Bikes Not Bombs here in Boston, your local state or bicycle organization, the national group People for Bikes, World Bicycle Relief, Citizens Climate Lobby, which is working to get a fee and dividend program on putting a price on the cost of fossil fuels, Greenpeace, and of course, Rails to Trails. So questions?
Okay, we got some questions here, and if other people want to submit questions, you could put it in the chat. So the first question is from Beverly. If you do the trip again, would you do a southern route or another route?
I thought about taking southern routes. If I'm lucky, I might get to do another bike trip somewhat similar to this, and I'd be very interested in taking a southern trip. Steve Bogue, who lives in West Roxbury and is a well-known bicyclist around here, did the southern route from San Diego to Florida. I think that would be an interesting trip to take in the fall. Did that answer the question?
I think so, yeah. the next trip. I have a question here. Let me scroll down. Oh yeah, from Catherine. Is there anything you would do differently in hindsight?
Yeah, I wouldn't carry so much stuff with me. I wouldn't have a cook stove or cook pot, even though they were small and lightweight. I would, yeah, I think that's about it. Just the weight.
Okay. And how much did you trip? I think you said you cycled from Boston to Oregon and you took Amtrak back to Boston. Can you talk a little about Amtrak, because a lot of people didn't know that you can bring a bike on Amtrak. Like, what is the process of bringing a
So
bike?
we're very fortunate that our national bicycle organizations have been very, very active in pushing Amtrak to be bicycle friendly. And in fact, it is now a favored way of getting to a destination with a bicycle or back from a bicycle trip by many, many bicyclists. I met a whole bunch of other bicyclists on Amtrak, or I saw them unloading their boxes. On the trains that have baggage cars, you can either box your bicycle. You can get the boxes at the Amtrak baggage desk. It's very easy. You just turn your handlebars and your pedals and put it in the box, and the baggage guy seals it up. Or many of the cars now have hanging racks for bicycles. On the trains that don't have baggage cars, which unfortunately for me was Albany to Boston, you can't take your bicycle unless it's a folding bicycle, in which case you can bring it in as luggage, as carry-on luggage. But my bicycle got shipped as freight from Albany to Washington, D.C., and then back to Boston. So, yeah, it's getting easier and easier to do. And Amtrak's making a point of attracting bicyclists.
That's good. And did you get any special health checkups before the trip? And also, just to add on, like, what is the emotional and physical training or preparation that you need to do to prepare for a trip like this? Because I can't imagine you can decide to go on a trip like this tomorrow. There must be a lot
Yeah,
of preparation.
I was going to take this trip last summer, and then COVID put an end to that. Though I will note that there's a Harvard ornithologist by the name of Scott Edwards. Looking him up on Twitter, Scott Edwards. He's a black guy. He took off in the middle of the summer of 2020. He had Black Lives Matter signs on his panniers, and he rode from Boston to Portland, Oregon. His Twitter documentation is really marvelous because he was having these fascinating conversations with people along the way about Black Lives Matter, right in the midst of all the civil turmoil and the midst of the COVID. And he just, upped and decided to do it. He rides bicycles, but, he wasn't in any particularly great shape. I actually got worried about not preparing enough. I had a busy spring. And I didn't ride quite as much. I don't think you really need to be in that great a shape, because guess what? After the first 3 or 4 days, you're going to be in shape. Maybe the thing to do is, as happened with me, my first week were relatively short rides. And at the more you bike, the better shape you get in. Emotionally, as I remarked at the beginning, I took off naive. I really didn't know what I was heading into, but it worked. I did talk with other people that had taken rides. There's a lot of materials available on the Adventure Cycling Association website, including books and user groups that they have. So yeah, it's pretty easy to figure out. You just need to do a little bit of homework and not worry too much about what shape you're in. Just get out there and start riding. If you can ride 10 miles one day, you can ride 20 miles the next and keep going after that. Next question.
Yeah. Did you bike in any heavy rain?
I did not. You know, I think I was lucky that I didn't get hit by any big, heavy rainstorms, except that one morning in Illinois. And it was warm out and I just got wet. That was it. Um, there was a pretty intense rainstorm in Nebraska that just blew in all of a sudden. It was one of those kind of remarkable things that happens out in the Midwest. Um, if it was a little colder, I would have been hit by rain, and I was frantically digging my heavy raincoat out of my panniers, and it just passed over me and left me drenched. But then the sun was shining again, and I dried off. I did talk with some people who had left earlier and had ridden through northern New England that had gotten cold and wet, but you know, they stop riding for a while. They go find a restaurant to sit in and warm up, change clothes. Yeah, it's not too much of a problem if you're riding, depending on the time of year you're riding.
Okay. And here's two questions here from Robert. Any challenges getting water, like bringing purification tablets? And were there any worries about security or crime?
I was never worried about security or crime. Yeah, there was one jerk someplace in Western New York who got impatient on a road that had no shoulders and a steep drop off into the ditch. He was in a diesel pickup truck, got up on my rear, and when the passing cars cleared, he went as close as he could to me, and he flipped his diesel exhaust switch when he went past me and tried to blow a diesel smoke at me. What he didn't realize is that I had a mirror on my helmet, and I would never ride a bicycle without a mirror on my helmet. And so I saw what he was up to, and I just hit my brakes as soon as he started to go around, and he completely missed me. Yeah. Occasionally some RV drivers who weren't very experienced would, get up a little close, and then they'd pass, and the car that they were pulling was a little close. But again, I could see that coming in my mirror, and so I was prepared. I was never personally worried about, stopping or camping any place. In fact, I rarely locked up my bicycle. I did make sure I kept it, within easy sight. I carried a small cable lock, but I rarely used that. Water. In the east of the Mississippi, food and water is never a problem because there's a service station or a small town, just a couple of miles away. In the west, it starts to become a problem, and you really have to think carefully. The one day that I got into trouble with water was in eastern Washington. I had a 80-mile ride that day, and I had left with 5 bottles. There was a small town in the middle of my ride. There was a wind to my back, and I made really good time. I went through those 5 bottles, and I only had 30 more miles to go. And for some foolish reason, I only decided to fill up 3 bottles. Well, eastern Washington, the temperature was in the mid-90s. It's bone dry. And even though it's comfortable to ride in that heat, that dry heat, you're just going through water unbelievably fast. And I was 10 miles from my destination when I ran out of water. I thought, well, I'll make it, but I won't be happy about it. And then around the corner, there was a road construction crew. And I pulled up and asked if anyone had any water. And 2 guys brought me 4 water bottles. There was a long ride along the Columbia River in Washington that was a 90-mile ride with only one little town in it. And the winds blowing down the Columbia Gorge were pretty strong. But I'd learned my lesson, and I had enough water with me. But yeah, you really have to think carefully about water and food. And in some instances, you've got to think about lodging unless you're prepared to primitive camp for the night, which some people do. I didn't, but a lot of people do it.
Okay. So when did you start planning this trip, and did you have to make any changes because of COVID? In the planning of the trip?
I started planning the trip in 2019, but I canceled it in 2020 because of COVID. But this year, I got fully vaccinated by the end of April, and To be honest, I did not mask at all. However, my alarm bells started to go off in Western Montana. I was sitting in this bar with my riding companion, bar restaurant. We were eating at the bar, and there were about 5 or 6 young bartenders going back and forth in front of us, and they were serving people who kept coming up to the bar between us. And I realized everybody here is unmasked, and it's Montana, so there's probably a lot of people who aren't vaccinated. And I had just gotten through reading a newspaper report about the rise of the Delta variant. And after that, I started masking again. And by the time I got to Oregon, everyone was masking out there. I think I just got through, because of the summer lull that was happening in the spread of the virus.
What kind of bike is best suited for a trip like this? Are e-bikes better? Would you use an e-bike if you had to do it over again?
I wouldn't personally use an e-bike, but I can see myself doing it in the future. I did talk with a couple of people who plan to use e-bikes or have taken shorter trips. I know there's a lot of bicycle touring going on in Europe with electric bikes. The thing about electric bikes is, the same thing with electric cars, and it's range anxiety. That is the battery capacity. The batteries are getting more and more powerful. They're dropping in price and dropping in weight. So I could see someone riding with 2 batteries easily, as long as they knew that there would be a place to recharge at the end of the day. For a trip, a touring bike is best. You don't want skinny road tires. I had 32 millimeter tires. A lot of people tour with slightly wider tires than that, 35 and up to 40, depending on the type of roads you're going to be on. But my 32s were just fine. That guy from Earn a Bike in Worcester, who was riding from Worcester to Pittsburgh, was on a clunky old, not very good mechanical 1970s bike. And then there were guys like me riding on fancy titanium bikes with the latest in hydraulic disc brakes and gearing technology. A lot of people do these trips with pretty regular bikes. I wouldn't go on a cheap mountain style bike, but most anything can do. You do want to pay a lot of attention to comfort because your wrists and your derriere are going to get pretty sore after a couple of days.
Yeah, a lot of cami butter recommend bringing on.
Yeah, I didn't include that in my slide. I had a Brooks saddle and I had the biggest tube of chamois butter possible.
And what kind of camera were you using on the trip? Was it just your phone or a GoPro?
Yeah, I took a camera drone with me, a mini camera drone that I ended up mailing to a friend because I realized I was never going to use it. And I was told that by my partner. Thank you, Ariane. I took a GoPro with me that I mounted on my handlebars, and I finally started using, but I bought an iPhone 12 before I left, and that was probably one of the best purchases after my bicycle that I made. It had lots of memory. It had the 5G signal. I had signal almost all the way across the country. I downloaded most of my maps so that when I didn't have signal, at least I had the GPS. And all the pictures you've seen tonight and all the videos came off of that camera. The technology is just amazing. I did take some paper maps with me though. My phone ran out of battery charge one day in Michigan, rural Michigan, and I learned the lesson about being sure to have some paper map with me.
What was the most surprising thing you learned about yourself on the trip?
That I could keep going day after day. Yeah. I think I was worried about that in the beginning, especially bicycling through the Berkshires with too much weight. I just kept thinking, I don't know if I can do this. I've got arthritis in both of my knees. I did get steroid injections before I left. I was worried about my knees giving out, but neither of those things happened. I just kept getting up every morning and packing my bag and making it to the next destination and learning as I went along. A friend of mine commented the other day to me that I seem more mellow. He said, "You're usually a kind of edgy guy." So maybe that's something that I learned along the way, to mellow out a little bit more. If I don't maintain that mellow, I invite my friends to remind me.
And what are your recommendations for somebody who would like to do this type of trip? Like what is the, you talked a lot about what to do, but someone's looking at this like, oh, I really want to do this trip. Like, what do you recommend that they first do?
The first thing I would do is to download the Rails to Trails app on your smartphone or iPad or computer, and look at all of the rail trails around you and find some that are 10, 20, 30, 50 miles long, and go take a 2-day bicycle trip on those trails. Don't take a lot of stuff with you. Stay in a motel along the way. There's lots of cheap motels. Just try out riding that distance. The nice thing about the rail trails is that they're never hills. You're not dealing with traffic. It's just the exercise of riding 40, 50 miles in a day. It's very doable. You take lots of breaks and you drink lots of food, and you can do it. Your muscles will keep going as long as you take care of them. The second thing I would do is just start asking around. There's a lot of other people around here. I met a guy in Dedham the other day, I think he's on this call, who rode across the country in 2017. John Sweeney, if you're there, John. I dropped your name. So that you'll discover there are people who do it, and they're happy to share with you. The other thing I would do is to join Adventure Cycling Association out of Missoula, Montana. And they have lots of resources. They have a user forum where you can ask lots of questions. You can read people's accounts of their trips. You can buy books that people have published about their trips. I just start dreaming. One thing that would be really easy to do is to plan a week's vacation bicycling the Erie Canal Path from Albany to Buffalo. And then take the train from Buffalo back to Albany and pick up your car. It's very doable. You can stay in motels along the way. You can camp out. You don't have to take tons of equipment. Just take the bicycle you've got and, whatever saddlebags you've got. Yeah. Start small, dream big.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm out of questions. I'm done with the questions, but did you have any final thoughts that you want to give the audience? Maybe a plug for Bikes Not Bombs.
Yeah. If you've got any interest in helping a really fabulous organization, donate to Bikes Not Bombs. They had their bike-a-thon last Sunday, and they didn't quite hit their fundraising goal. They could use some more money. And do me a favor, if you do donate to Bikes Not Bombs, just mention that I suggested it. I keep trying to be the volunteer of the year, and I don't quite meet the threshold. They've got some incredibly devoted volunteers who raise lots of money for them, including this guy, David Ween, who's also on this call. So thanks, everyone. I appreciate your time. I hope this was enjoyable. I look forward to seeing you all and talking with you more. I appreciate everyone's support. And again, if you have a group that you'd like for me to present to, I would be delighted to do it. So that's it. Ciao.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And this video will be on the Friends website later this week. Okay. Thank you. Bye.